I'm going to take a different tact. I'm going to start out by saying, how do we think about grassroots movement? And historically, we often think about mass movements, especially for the last 50 years or so, around very specific issues. They're mass movements. We often don't articulate sort of brush fires that are small movements that go on in our society all the time. But mass movements start slowly, okay, with fits and starts, without clearly defined policies and programs. I mention that because of the Occupy movement and the complaints against it. It's not having a clearly defined program other than injustice, inequality, and unfairness. But those small struggles around those basic issues build what Sherry Lincoln and I call a community of interest and a community of memory in communities. And our community has a long history of that. And that shouldn't be forgotten. This area has had a long history of racial conflict, ethnic conflict, religious conflict, mob conflict, labor conflict, class conflict. Those struggles shape this community and their fights for social and economic justice. That's why it's important to remember them as we move forward and have this discussion. The community groups and the steelworkers who organized the fight against shutdowns here, like no other place in the United States, and that had a very important role in establishing limited forms of industrial policy. That struggle at its heart was a fight for economic justice, equality, and fairness in the face of economic restructuring and disinvestment. Locally, the memory also informs the current struggles that are going on in the organizing of Chris and the other members of the MVOC, who have organized 44 neighborhoods in the Youngstown area. Occupy movement in Youngstown, that is Occupy Youngstown, has contributed to changing the local and national discussion from austerity, which was the major theme through last August in this country, to one of social and economic justice. Now, all these movements are not necessarily the same, and will they be repeated. I talked to my classes about it. Grassroots movements now are slightly different because of technology. Okay, there's an enormous amount of social networking that gather and share information quickly. While no panacea, when combined with traditional one-on-one grassroots organizing, technology has become a very powerful tool, somewhat invisible at times, but still a very important tool. You take, for example, what happened in Wisconsin and Ohio last year around the collective bargaining fight. Take a look at what happened in the Arab Spring and the uses of technology and the organizing that went on. So I think it's important that we have a discussion and we talk about grassroots movements and how they're developing, how they're similar and how they're different. The next thing just to say about the middle class, I don't know what the middle class is. I know that sounds very strange, but for those of us who study class, we know it's socially constructed. For example, if I ask my students what class they're in, one woman said, well, I'm middle class, I make $35,000 a year. If you interrogate that, she works 3 jobs in 70 hours, yet she's middle class. Well, she is by definition partly that we saw up in the movie. But at the same time, her relationship to the production process, her relationship to all sorts of things in the society make her clearly working class. But the middle class are now joining these movements, okay? Because the middle class has found out that they're one job from poverty. That's what middle class means. And at the same time, we've seen white-collar workers, college students, professional workers, all suffering the same fate as the working class has faced over the years. For them, the American dream has become a nightmare. They're angry, they're increasingly resentful, and they're increasingly willing to stand up against the unfairness and injustice and inequality that's associated with globalization, the housing crisis, the Wall Street deceits and bailouts, the unfair taxes, and the Iraq War. There's also a different demographic to this fight, and that's the millennials. Okay? For those who don't know what a millennial is, they're the people that have come of age after 2000. They're different, as I know from my students. Their zeitgeist is different. For better or worse, they're much more open-minded. They're less sectarian in terms of their point of views. And I think sometimes that's also reflected in the new Occupy movement. Some people criticize the Occupy movement because it lacks a clear program, yet it's very reluctant to focus in the face of pressure from some groups pushing for one issue or another. I don't think that we should subsume or to those issues right now. I think we're at a point where the broader organizing themes of injustice, inequality, and fairness are really crucial. Lastly, just say one thing about some of the issues about race. And this is much more problematic. I think there needs to be an acceptance in 2012 that there are multiple sites of oppression. Okay? It's not just race. When Jesse Jackson says we don't need a national discussion on race, we need it on class, I think he's got a point. Okay? And I think we can have an absolute diverse society, and we can still have enormous economic inequality. And we really have to sort of consider that when we try and think about privileging one type of identity, whether race, gender, religion, or whatever, over another.